You thought history was boring? Well, ancient historians didn't think so. Fun history. Fun, weird, and without silly dates. Welcome to a world where your local fast food joint doesn't exist. The vending machine hasn't been invented, and the only thing on the menu is whatever you can catch, grow, or pry out of a neighbor's tree without getting stabbed. Tonight, we're diving fork first into the glorious grease pit of medieval junk food. And let me tell you, some of it was surprisingly delicious. Some of it was nightmare fuel. And all of it was deeply, gloriously medieval. Before we get our hands sticky, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I genuinely love knowing there's someone in Tokyo watching this at 4 a.m. while questioning their life choices. Now dim those lights and let's ease into tonight's culinary time machine. The accidental donut. In an era where most edible items looked like they'd already been chewed once and tasted like regret, apple fritters emerged as a rare victory for humanity. Sweet, hot, and carrying just enough risk of third-degree burns to make things interesting. These golden discs were basically the medieval version of donuts, just without the frosting or anything resembling food safety standards. So what went into a fritter back when Best Buy dates were measured in, does it smell worse than the barn yet? Apples. But not shiny supermarket specimens. We're talking small, angry, knobby little fruits that grew behind the alehouse and may or may not have been acquired through questionable nighttime activities involving your neighbor's orchard. These bad boys were chopped up, tossed into a rough batter of flour, eggs, and occasionally ale. Why ale? Because drinking water was basically playing Russian roulette with your intestines, and ale made everything feel slightly more cheerful. Now let's talk about the frying situation. Deep frying in the 1300s wasn't just cooking, it was performance art with a side of danger. The oil, usually pig fat because nothing says snack time like liquefied pork, was reused until it achieved sentience. We're talking oil that had seen things. Oil that could probably vote. But here's the thing. When you pulled a fritter out of that bubbling cauldron of questionable history, the result was magical. Crispy edges, a soft center, and that faint whisper of risk that made every bite feel like an adventure. If you were lucky enough to be born into wealth, your fritter might get dusted with imported sugar. This wasn't just dessert. This was a social media post before social media existed. It said, "Look at me, I have enough money to make my fried apples sparkle." For everyone else, a drizzle of honey did the trick. Fritters were the original street food. You'd grab one at a fair, after church, or on market day when you needed a treat and didn't mind spending the afternoon trying to get grease stains out of your only tunic. Kids loved them. Adults loved them. Birds tried to steal them because even pigeons in the Middle Ages had refined tastes. The squeaky snack. If apple fritters were the medieval donut, then cheese curds were basically the popcorn of the Dark Ages. Bite-sized, slightly squeaky, and wildly inconsistent. These little dairy nuggets weren't flashy. They didn't melt dramatically. In fact, they barely did anything at all, and that's precisely what made them perfect. Let's be real about medieval cheese. It wasn't aiming for artisanal glory. It was made fast, eaten faster, and expected to survive long journeys, questionable storage, and the occasional goat stepping on it during the aging process. Cheese curds were essentially baby cheese, the fresh little bits that came along before the wheel hardened into something that could double as construction material. These delightful clumps were a byproduct of the cheese-making process. Farmers would separate milk into curds and whey using rennet, which sounds fancy until you learn it came from the stomach lining of a baby animal. But hey, medieval Europe wasn't exactly known for ethical sourcing. The curds were pressed lightly, salted a bit, and that was it. Sometimes they came out soft, sometimes rubbery, and sometimes they squeaked on your teeth like they had opinions about being eaten. But they were filling, portable, and weirdly satisfying. In a time when snack usually meant old bread you found in your pocket, cheese curds felt like winning the lottery. Monks loved them, probably because they could eat them during silent contemplation without making noise. Travelers packed them. Kids ate them like candy, assuming the cows had been cooperative. You could fry them, crumble them over stews, or just eat them by the handful while pretending you didn't smell like the inside of a barn. Unlike many medieval foods that required celebrations, cheese curds weren't saved for special occasions. They were just there, comforting and familiar, like that friend who never overperforms but shows up reliably when everything falls apart. Did they sometimes taste a little off? Sure, freshness was more of a suggestion in the Middle Ages. But with enough salt and enthusiasm, most people didn't complain. Besides, when your alternative is another bowl of boiled turnips, a squeaky cheese curd starts looking pretty gourmet. The vegetable that thought it was dessert. Let's establish something right now. Turnips are not dessert. They're not even really lunch. They're what you eat when you run out of options and self-respect. But in the medieval world, where sugar cost more than your house and apples only showed up for a few weeks a year, creative desperation became its own food group. Someone, somewhere, looked at a turnip and thought, what if this were pie? And thus, turnip pie entered the world. Now, to be fair, it wasn't always terrible. Sometimes, with a good cook and low expectations, it was almost edible. Picture mashed turnips, hopefully cooked until tender, blended with an egg, maybe some honey or dried fruit if the cook was feeling generous. Then bake it inside a sturdy crust made from flour, water, and pure ambition. The result? Surprisingly survivable. At its best, turnip pie was warm, a little sweet, and had that vaguely comforting root vegetable pudding vibe. At its worst, it tasted like someone had mistaken livestock feed for a baking ingredient and just decided to roll with it. You know that feeling when you bite into something and immediately understand why your ancestors had such short life expectancies? That was turnip pie on an off day. These pies were popular for two main reasons. First, turnips were cheap. Like, unbelievably cheap. You could grow them everywhere, they stored well, and nobody was fighting you for the last turnip. Second, pie crust could hide a multitude of sins. Whether the turnips were overripe, undercooked, or suspiciously bitter, once you baked them into a pastry shell and added enough honey, they became peasant cuisine with aspirations. Was it cheesecake? No, but it tried, and in medieval Europe, trying counted for a lot. You'd find these pies at fairs, on feast tables, and in particularly enthusiastic monasteries where the monks had too much free time and an alarming surplus of root vegetables. Nobles didn't eat turnip pie unless they were slumming it for fun. But for everyone else, it was dessert. Sort of. More like an afterthought with pastry attached. The original Hot Pocket. If the medieval world had a comfort food MVP, it was absolutely the meat pasty. A handheld pie stuffed with seasoned meat, tucked into a folded crust and baked until golden brown or slightly scorched, depending on who was watching the oven. Basically, a medieval Hot Pocket, minus the microwave instructions and plus a genuine sense of danger. The beauty of the pasty was its portability. You could eat it on the road, in the fields, while watching a public execution, whatever the day demanded. Wrapped in a thick pastry crust that would make modern health inspectors weep, it stayed warm for hours and protected the precious meat filling from dirt, rats, and the occasional peasant sneeze. But let's talk about that filling, because meat in the Middle Ages was a flexible term. If you lived near a manor, you might get pork, mutton, or venison. If not, your options expanded considerably. Rabbit, pigeon, eel, hedgehog, anything that once had legs could be diced, seasoned, and hidden inside pastry with plausible deniability. Spices played a crucial role, and by that I mean they were used to enhance flavor, or, more realistically, to distract you from it. Pepper, sage, and garlic helped, but they couldn't completely hide the fact that the meat had been resting a few days longer than it should have. Still, in an era when refrigeration was a fantasy and lunch was often just bread and onions, a meaty pasty felt genuinely indulgent. There were even vegetarian versions for fasting days, filled with root vegetables or cheese. But make no mistake, the meat ones were the crowd pleasers. They were greasy, hot, and comforting in ways that made you temporarily forget about the Black Death. You didn't ask what was inside, you just ate it and hoped the cook had been in a good mood. Here's a fun detail. People sometimes marked their pasty crusts with initials to claim ownership, especially among miners working far from home. In some regions, the crust was extra thick along one edge, so it could be held with dirty hands and then tossed away. Sometimes to spirits, sometimes to rats, and sometimes because nobody wanted to eat the handle. So, were they good? Often, yes. Were they mysterious? Always. But that was part of the charm. The medieval breath mint. In a world where brushing your teeth meant rinsing with wine and hoping for the best, candied fennel seeds were basically the closest thing medieval people had to Tic Tacs. Tiny, sugary, vaguely herbal, they served multiple purposes: treat, digestive aid, and dental hazard, all in one oddly satisfying crunch. These little seeds were coated in a hard shell of sugar, which sounds simple until you remember that sugar had to be imported, boiled, beaten, and poured by hand. Someone somewhere really believed in the potential of these tiny snacks. They were especially popular in noble households, where guests might be handed a small dish after dinner to freshen the mouth, which was code for, "Please distract yourself from the mutton still clinging to your mustache." Flavor-wise, fennel seeds had a strong licorice bite. You either loved them or politely swallowed them whole while regretting everything. Candied seeds also had a job to do: digestion. People believed fennel helped settle the stomach, especially after a heavy meal involving 3 types of birds and alarming amounts of meat. Think of them as medieval chewing gum crossed with Tums, but with more potential to chip a tooth. And yes, they were hard. Like, crack your molar if you're too confident hard. You didn't just crunch candied fennel seeds. You tested one first, gently, listened for concerning sounds, then committed. It was a risk-reward situation every time. While the wealthy popped them like medieval breath mints, common folk got knockoff versions with honey and crushed herbs. Not quite the same, but good enough to pretend you were nobility. The cake that could survive a siege. If medieval desserts had a golden child, it was the honey cake. Sweet, dense, and prone to sticking to everything except your expectations. These were what happened when bakers got ambitious and sugar was still locked away in some castle treasury like Fort Knox. Honey was the sweetener of the people, assuming those people had access to bees or weren't afraid of climbing trees and getting stung repeatedly. These cakes were made with flour, water, and generous spoonfuls of honey, or at least what passed for generous in an era where spoons were mostly used to fight off siblings. The result was a firm, chewy slab that could either be a delightful snack or a makeshift doorstop, depending on how long it had been sitting near the hearth. Spices were sometimes added if the household was feeling wealthy. Nutmeg or cinnamon could give the honey cake flair, and by flair, I mean the ability to cause an entire village to talk about your recipe for a week. Honey cakes were popular at feasts and weddings because they could be made ahead, didn't spoil quickly, and could survive being dropped, stepped on, or thrown in a mild food fight. They were also used as gifts, bribes, and occasionally passive-aggressive statements. "Here, I made this for you. It's sweet, unlike your personality." Structurally, these weren't delicate. Many resembled compact bricks. Slicing them required a sturdy knife and the quiet hope that nobody was watching you struggle. Eating them was easier, just don't expect a fluffy bite. These cakes were built for medieval life. Tough, durable, and coated in enough sticky honey to make your hands feel like you'd lost a fight with a beehive. But they were satisfying. They tasted like warmth and indulgence, like those rare moments when you weren't chewing salted barley or chasing rats out of your food storage. Fish skin, because nothing should go to waste. Fried fish skin cracklings might be the most unexpectedly delightful snack to emerge from a culture that also thought eel pie was reasonable. These crispy, salty strips weren't glamorous, but they were brutally efficient. Waste not, want not, especially when working with a fish that smells like it's judging your life. Nobody set out to invent this snack. More likely, some thrifty cook was staring at discarded fish skins and thought, what if we just fried it? A splash of hot fat later, history was made. Fish skin was plentiful, especially in coastal towns where herring or cod was processed on site. The meat went to the stew pot, the heads went to the cat, and the skins got thrown into bubbling oil and sizzled into submission. The result was surprisingly addictive. A thin, crispy snack that crunched like a dried leaf but tasted like concentrated ocean. A pinch of salt elevated the experience, a hint of garlic, and suddenly you were flirting with culinary excellence. These cracklings weren't just tasty, they were practical. Lightweight and high in fat, exactly what a medieval body craved after a day of hauling firewood. Soldiers packed them. Sailors lived off them. Peasants sold them outside taverns for the satisfaction of feeding drunk people something louder than their conversations. Did they sometimes still have scales? Yes. Did they curl into shapes that made you question life choices? Also yes. But by medieval standards, they were downright elegant. The only drawback was the smell. These things could announce themselves from 3 huts away. If you fried a batch indoors, your home would smell like Poseidon's laundry for a week. But you'd be forgiven because they tasted good. When bread met beer. When life gave you stale bread and warm beer, you didn't cry. You made the most medieval snack imaginable. Bread soaked in ale. Known as sops, this humble creation was the original comfort food. Think French toast without the eggs, sugar, cinnamon, or joy. Here's how it worked. You took yesterday's bread, the kind that could double as construction material, and dunked it into a bowl of ale. Not fancy craft ale. This was flat, low-alcohol medieval ale, brewed in someone's smoky back room with the hygiene standards of a barn owl. The bread absorbed the ale like a sponge with commitment issues. It softened and transformed from a jawbreaker-level hazard into something vaguely edible. Was it tasty? With low expectations, yes. It was warm, bready, and carried the gentle bitterness of fermented grain, which is to say, it didn't actively offend your palate. This snack was especially popular with the working class, people who needed calories that wouldn't fight back. Bread soaked in ale was quick, hearty, and just messy enough to feel like a real break from chores. Sometimes people added extras, herbs, cheese, or a fried egg if the hen was generous. Like many medieval dishes, this had dual purpose. Not only was it food, it was also a way to stretch ingredients. Bread too stale to chew? Soak it. Ale starting to turn? Pour it on bread and pretend it's intentional. Waste was for amateurs. The only downside? It didn't travel well. Once soaked, the bread turned into sloshy porridge. Eat it quickly or risk ending up with a mushy sponge and a 1,000-year-old metaphor for disappointment. Wine sops. Because you're better than regular sops. If you've ever looked at bread and thought, this would be better submerged in alcohol, congratulations, you and the medieval upper class have something in common. Sops in wine were one of the more refined snacks of the Middle Ages. The concept was simple. Take bread and dunk it in wine. Not just any wine, of course. Usually mulled, sweetened, or spiced wine. Something warm that barely hid the fact it had been sitting in a clay jug since last harvest. Once the bread was sufficiently drenched, it was served as a soft, spoonable delicacy. Nobles called it elegant. Everyone else wondered if the cook had just run out of ideas. This was not finger food. It was eaten with a spoon, very slowly, while pretending to be interested in lute music. When done well, sops in wine were warm, comforting, and mildly intoxicating. The wine added richness, the bread gave texture, and the spices made you feel fancy. When done poorly, it was wet bread in a bowl, and no amount of cinnamon could cover that up. Sometimes dried fruits or nuts were added, sometimes cheese, occasionally a whole egg. At that point, it became a culinary guessing game. Peasants made versions with cheap vinegar or ale instead of wine. It wasn't dessert then, it was dinner, or whatever you call a meal that leaves you both full and confused. Still, sops in wine had staying power. They were warm, filling, and gave medieval people a taste of indulgence, even if that taste involved sponge soaked in grape-flavored regret. Dried fruit, nature's candy. if nature was aggressively chewy. In the Middle Ages, dried fruit was a prized treat. Sugary, exotic, and shelf-stable enough to survive a crusade. But let's be clear, this wasn't your modern trail mix. Medieval dried fruit had one job: to last. Taste was optional. Texture was aggressively chewy. Dental damage was guaranteed. You had your usual suspects: raisins, figs, dates, and if you were fancy, imported prunes. These were fruits that had been sun-dried, smoke-dried, or just forgotten on a windowsill until they no longer qualified as moist. They were wrinkled, tough, and alarmingly dense, an edible time capsule from last harvest. The upside? Dried fruit was really sweet. Concentrated sugars turned these shriveled things into medieval candy. Nobles loved them, monks hoarded them, and children treated them like rare loot. The downside? Chewing them was like fighting your own jaw. Figs came with seeds that doubled as dental floss. Dates were sticky enough to glue your molars together. There was no such thing as eating dried fruit quietly. Still, dried fruit had its moments. It was used in pies, added to porridge, or thrown into honey cakes for variety. Rich folks wrapped them in pastry or soaked them in wine to impress guests. For commoners, getting dried fruit was a special occasion. You'd eat it slowly, possibly while hiding in the barn so you didn't have to share. Storage was easy. Dried fruit didn't spoil and was kept in cloth sacks. It hardened over time, which just made it a longer-lasting snack, or a projectile if you had younger siblings. Blood pudding balls, not for the faint of heart. You wake up hungry. You want something hearty, something fried, something that might bite back. Enter the blood pudding ball, a medieval snack so bold, so unapologetically iron-rich, it makes modern sausage rolls look like timid breadsticks. Born from using every part of the animal, these savory spheres were proof that waste not, want not applied even when what you weren't wasting was blood. First, collect fresh animal blood, usually pig, though any blood would do. Mix it with oats, onions, suet, and spices. Once this morbid porridge reaches the right grimness, shape it into balls and fry until the outside crisps up like it has something to prove. The result? Dark, crispy orbs of protein with a rich, earthy flavor, which is code for you'll taste iron for the rest of the day. Best served hot, though sometimes eaten cold if your appetite outweighed your fear of congealed fat. Nobles dressed them up with pepper or eggs. Peasants were just happy not to be chewing boiled cabbage. Blood pudding balls weren't elegant, but they were practical. Easy to carry, high in calories, and alarmingly filling. Eat 2 and you could skip lunch. Eat 4 and you were probably a blacksmith or trying to win a dare. These snacks were common at fairs and markets where everything smelled like livestock. They were especially popular in winter because nothing warms the soul like fried coagulation. Of course, they weren't for everyone. Some didn't love the texture, others didn't love the concept. But in a world where survival came first, these morsels earned their place in the medieval junk food Hall of Fame. Pancakes, not what you're thinking. Forget everything about fluffy stacks with maple syrup. Medieval pancakes were completely different. They were thinner, tougher, and cooked in enough lard to make your arteries consider early retirement. But they got the job done, and when your other option was thin soup that was sad about its existence, they were kind of a treat. Made from flour, eggs, and water or ale, these pancakes were poured onto a sizzling iron griddle coated in bubbling pig fat. No nonstick pans, no portion control. You just ladled and hoped. The result was a flat, uneven circle with crispy edges and a chewy center. The kind of pancake that could survive a horseback ride and still be mostly edible. Sometimes it was burnt, sometimes raw, sometimes both. Flavor depended on what you had. Ale added tang. Honey was luxury. Herbs were adventurous. But most of the time it was just pancake and grease, served hot and inhaled like you'd outrun a tax collector. These pancakes were democratic. Everyone ate them. Peasants, nobles, monks. Some layered them with cheese. Some dunked them in broth. Others just rolled them up and called it a meal. You could eat them sweet, savory, or scorched. Leftovers could be stacked and pretend to be cake, or armor, or whatever you needed. They were especially popular during Lent when meat was off the menu. Pancakes became a loophole, fried, filling, and somehow both humble and indulgent. Plus, they were excellent for disguising other ingredients that had no business being in your mouth. And while not beautiful, medieval pancakes had staying power. They didn't need praise, they just needed a hot pan and a willing stomach. Wafers, the original communion candy. Somewhere between a snack and a sacrament, we find the medieval wafer. A thin, crisp, suspiciously light biscuit that danced between dessert and dental challenge. Wafers were everywhere. Outside churches, at village fairs, in monks' hands, and occasionally floating in soup like flat, holy croutons. Let's clarify, we're not talking about chocolate-dipped delights. Medieval wafers were made of flour, water, eggs, and not much else. If feeling fancy, you might add honey or rose water. Thin batter was poured onto hot metal irons and pressed like a medieval panini press. The result looked like it belonged in communion and tasted like crispy paper with ambitions. Wafers were popular because they were portable, fast to make, and could be sold in massive quantities for profit. Vendors set up outside churches on feast days, waving stacks at the faithful leaving Mass. Buy now, sin later wasn't the slogan, but it was the vibe. They were often shaped with religious symbols or floral patterns, depending on the mold and how tired the baker was. These designs didn't enhance flavor, but gave you something to stare at while pretending you weren't disappointed. Structurally, wafers were delicate. They cracked if you looked at them wrong. Storing them was a challenge, making outdoor eating a high-stakes affair involving crumbs and wind. Still, they were beloved. Light, crispy, and vaguely celebratory, wafers were the medieval version of treating yourself without wrecking your digestion or wallet. Suck it. The name says it all. Suck it. Even the name sounds sticky. This medieval treat was fruit boiled into submission, drowned in syrup, and sealed in a jar like a sweet hostage. Think candied oranges or ginger, coated in enough sugar to make your teeth tingle and your conscience whisper, "You shouldn't eat this." But you did, because it was delicious and imported. Suck it wasn't for the peasant chewing their seventh onion. This was elite snacking, served in noble halls or gifted by wealthy people to say, "I like you, but not enough to give you land." Sugar was expensive, so suck it was reserved for weddings, royal visits, or Wednesdays if you were outrageously rich. The preparation was obsessive. Boil fruit in syrup, drain, dry, repeat several times. You weren't just preserving fruit, you were declaring war on moisture. The result was a glossy, jewel-toned bite of candy, chewy, intense, and sweet enough to be weaponized. Some versions were soft and syrupy in ornate glass jars. Others were dry, rolled in sugar, and handed out as dainty cubes of medieval hypoglycemia. But Suck It came with status. It announced you had access to sugar, trade routes, and a servant dedicated to stirring things. Suck It trays were passed after banquets like edible gold. Guests took one piece and immediately regretted not grabbing three. Commoners watched from the kitchen and maybe licked a spoon. Was it worth it? Yes. Suck It was one of the few medieval snacks that genuinely felt like dessert. The sausage pillow, when dinner doubled as bedding. Picture this. You've been walking for hours. You're exhausted, your back hurts, and you're starving. Suddenly, a vendor offers you a pillow, an edible one. Meet the sausage pillow, a massive foot-long sausage stuffed with pork, beef, fat, and spices. So thick and soft, you could literally sleep on it. And people did. Medieval travelers didn't mess around with inflatable neck pillows or memory foam. They bought these monstrous sausages, used them as headrests during their journey, and when they woke up, they took a bite out of their pillow for breakfast. It was the original multifunctional gadget. Food plus sleep accessory, all in one greasy package. These sausages were made about 6 to 8 inches in diameter, stuffed with whatever meat was available and boiled or smoked until they reached the consistency of a firm memory foam alternative. A good sausage pillow wouldn't spoil for months, could support the weight of a grown man's head, and smelled strongly enough of garlic and cumin to keep the bugs away. Imagine a modern travel neck pillow, except it's made of ground pork and leaves a garlic-scented imprint on your cheek. Of course, by morning, the sausage would be slightly flattened where you'd been sleeping. The fat would have warmed up from your body heat, and you'd wake up with sausage grease in your hair and the desperate urge to eat your own bedding. But for a medieval person, this was luxury travel. Forget inns with bed bugs. Just pull out your sausage, put it under your head, and dream of bacon. And when morning came, breakfast was literally right there, slightly warm and smelling like your own face. Frumenty, the porridge that ate itself. Oats, water, salt, maybe some broth. This was frumenty, the basic porridge that kept medieval peasants alive. Sounds boring, right? Wrong, because on feast days, this humble porridge transformed into an absolute monster. Into the pot went everything: eggs, almonds, raisins, cinnamon, saffron to make it look fancy and yellow, and sometimes entire chunks of meat that stuck out of the bowl like drowning victims reaching for help. Frumenty was so thick you could stand a spoon up in it. Actually, you could probably stand a sword up in it. In some recipes, the porridge was poured onto a platter and allowed to set into a solid mountain shape. This edible mountain was then decorated with fried onions, pomegranate seeds, and chunks of bacon. It was served as an edible landscape. Literally. Chef, the guests are coming. Build them a mountain of porridge, stick some meat on it, and put a flag on top. But here's where it gets truly unhinged. Sometimes frumenty was served as a surprise. Inside this massive porridge mountain, they'd bake an entire bird or even a small piglet. You'd be eating your porridge, minding your own business, and suddenly your spoon would hit something solid. Congratulations, you found a pig's ear. It was the medieval version of a Kinder Surprise egg, except instead of a plastic toy, you got a whole animal face staring at you from your breakfast. The live bird pie, when dessert attacks. You think modern restaurants with smoking dishes and molecular gastronomy are fancy? Please. You haven't lived until you've experienced the medieval live bird pie. Yes, you read that right. Live, birds, inside, a pie. This spectacle was called a surprise pie and was served at banquets for the ultra-rich who were bored with regular food. Here's how it worked. They'd make a massive pie with an extra sturdy crust, bake it empty, and then, wait for it, they'd poke a hole in the bottom and stuff live birds inside. Usually songbirds like nightingales or small finches, because nothing says fancy dinner like potential bird poop on your velvet sleeves. The pie would be carried ceremoniously to the table, placed before the guests, and at the dramatic moment, someone would slice it open, and the birds would fly out. Guests would scream, with delight, presumably. Birds would relieve themselves on the tablecloth. Dogs would lose their minds. Everyone would clap and consider this the pinnacle of culinary achievement. Imagine going to a birthday party today, and instead of a cake with candles, they bring out a box and release pigeons into the living room. You'd sue. In medieval times, this was haute cuisine. Sometimes they didn't use birds. Sometimes it was frogs. Equally fun, less messy. Sometimes, and this is where it gets dark, they'd put in dwarfs or jesters who would pop out and perform. But birds were the classic. It was simultaneously dinner, entertainment, and an ecological disaster in a single pie crust. The Middle Ages weren't just dark, they were unhinged. People slept on sausages, ate porridge mountains with surprises inside, and launched live birds from pies because regular food was just too boring. So next time you complain about your DoorDash being late or your burger having too little sauce, remember, it could be worse. You could be sitting in a banquet hall full of flying nightingales, trying to catch your dinner before it escapes through the window.